Before we begin, there are a few housekeeping items I'd like to go through. If you can hear me okay, please use the raise hand option located on your control panel. Okay, great. There will be a recording of the webinar shared via email within 24 hours. And at the conclusion today, there will be a short survey that pops up on your screen. If you do not have the time to complete the survey now, it will also be shared in your follow-up email. We'll be conducting 2 polls during the webinar, so when prompted on your screen, please choose the best answer to the question you will see. And lastly, if you have a question during the webinar, please use the questions portion of your control panel to submit them, and we will answer all the questions we have time for at the end of the webinar. So again, I want to thank you for joining us for the Librarian as Scholar, Developing Your Research Interests. Scholars often rely on librarians as gatekeepers and tour guides of information in a variety of different fields. But today we'll explore if librarians, especially reference librarians, should also be engaged in librarian as scholar activities. I would now like to introduce our presenters. We have Brian Coutts, Head of Public Services at Western Kentucky University, and who is also the winner of RUSA's 2017 Isidore Mudge Award, which we at Credo Reference have the pleasure of sponsoring. Joining Brian today, we also have Rosemary Meszaros, Government Information and Law Coordinator from Western Kentucky University, who is also a member of the Mudge Award Committee. So thank you for joining us today, and Rosemary and Brian, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Caitlin. Let's get started, Brian. There you are.
Well, good afternoon, and glad you could join us. We're beaming out here from sunny Bowling Green, Kentucky.
Now, Brian, how did you get to be a cover boy for Library Journal?
You know, it was somewhat accidental. I had begun my reviewing career with Library Journal, reviewing coming-of-age novels, and was approached by the editor of the time, Janet Fletcher, and she said, there's lots of people reviewing coming-of-age novels. What about reviewing reference books? And in 1986, then, I began consulting with the editors of Library Journal, and we created for the first time in some years a Best Reference of the Year feature, which appeared in the April 15th issue of Library Journal. And 3 years later, to celebrate my involvement and taking over of that column, I appeared for the first time on the cover of Library Journal, sitting outside the stacks here at Western Kentucky University.
Okay, discuss how librarianship became the scholar in the United States. Before there were professional trained librarians who filled that role, and how does librarianship become a profession in the U.S.?
Well, initially, scholars were the librarians. People often ask, you know, before Melville Dewey helps establish the American Library Association in 1876, who were the librarians? Well, the scholars were the librarians, often trained in the arts, sometimes historians, sometimes English specialists. We know a good deal about the role of one particular scholar who became keeper of the printed book at the British Museum, Richard Garnett. His father, in 1838, had become the assistant keeper of the printed books at the British Museum, which was the largest collection of printed material in the United Kingdom. And his 16-year-old son, in 1851, began working at the British Museum, and some 40 years later, he too would rise to become the penultimate library physician in the United Kingdom as keeper of the printed books. He was a scholar. He wrote more than 60 books in his lifetime. He published 7 volumes of poetry. He wrote biographies of Emerson and Carlyle and Coleridge. And he began writing articles for early reference sources, such as the Encyclopedia Britannica, and wrote 100 sketches for the Dictionary of National Biography. He was one of the earliest of the Shelley scholars, and wrote a novel called The Twilights of the Gods. He was most famous, however, for his ability to guide and help readers in selecting books at the British Museum library. And in fact, a library where Karl Marx was actively involved in the 1860s and writing the first chapters for his Das Kapital, which Richard Garnett later reviewed in 1868. And Garnett's daughter, in fact, was a close personal friend of Karl Marx. Garnett introduced some things we would today as associate with librarians, that you should provide great service sitting at a reference desk. He invented a kind of a teletype system where he could teletype messages back to the closed stacks, and runners would bring the materials to the desk for users to have access to.
So how did reference service get over to this side of the pond?
Well, Melville Dewey, who was from a small town in New York, had begun attending Amherst College in Massachusetts, and in 1873, while working in the college library, which was somewhat confusing, he thought, to patrons, had come up with his decimal classification system. And he had presented that to the faculty of Amherst College, and when Dewey had graduated the next year, he was engaged as the librarian and allowed to convert the collection at Amherst into what became the first library organized by the Dewey Decimal Classification System. He published that in 1876, and at the same time became a strong advocate for the need for would-be librarians to associate in a national association, and helped found the American Library Association in 1876. He also thought that we needed to have a professional training system for librarians in the United States. Heretofore, we had not had one, and while engaged as the librarian at Columbia University, he found the really first school of library science, then called the School of Library Economy, in 1887. That lasts only a year at Columbia, and it was eventually moved to the State Library at Albany. And most of what we think of as the early generation of American librarians are trained at Dewey's School of Library Economy at the State Library.
So how did Isidore Mudge get into the business?
Isidore Mudge was a student of Melville Dewey's at the State Library in New York. She had been born in 1851. She had been born in 1893, not 1851, and she was the granddaughter of both a librarian and a former president of Cornell University. She attended a preparatory school in Brooklyn, New York at Adelphi College, and at the age of 18 entered Cornell University and engaged in a rigorous curriculum, especially in, she majored in history with a minor in Latin, and would later claim that she had been interested, really developed her passion for reference by taking classes from a famous medieval historian at Cornell. After graduating from Cornell, she took some time off and tried to decide what kind of career she should pursue, and in the end was persuaded to enroll for the two-year program at the State Library at Albany in the School of Library Economy. She completed that rather rigorous program of the time, and with Dewey's assistance, she received an offer from a former Dewey student, Catherine Sharp, who was then director of the University of Illinois Library, and Isidore was invited to join the faculty at the University of Illinois as a reference librarian, and she arrived there and began working in the first few years of the 20th century. Isidore would later write that she worked 25 hours a week in reference. For our people who complain these days about their long reference shifts, she also taught 2 courses. And at Illinois, then Isidore Mudge begins her life mission to amass a collection of reference materials. She defined a reference book at the time as any work which may be of use to a large number of persons, unless ordered by a department library. And she even allowed reference books to be checked out after 9 p.m. Monday through Thursday and on weekends. Her goals, she said, as she began developing the reference collection for the University of Illinois, were to build a balanced collection of important resources in English, to make it accessible, and to make it useful by providing directions and notes and guides, kind of the forerunner of our research guides of today to the books themselves. And she believed that you should give personal help in the use of the library whenever possible. And in giving such help, endeavor always to help the student to independent and intelligent use of the library resource themselves, which is, I think, a practice we use today. Fortunate, one of the people she meets at the University of Illinois, her first year there, another famous librarian, Minnie Earl Sears, who would later invent the Sears subject heading and become one of the editors of the Essay and General Literature Index. And 3 years after her reference stint at Illinois, she's invited to become the head of the library at Bryn Mawr, and moves east and occupies that position from 1903 to 1907. After 4 years as head librarian at Bryn Mawr, she takes time off to travel to Europe, and she and Sears begin engaged in working on their very first collaborative reference book on George Eliot. Somewhere near the end of that 4-year period, she was approached by the American Library Association and invited to take over a project that had begun by Alice Kroger, who had been the head of the library at Drexel. And Alice Kroger in 1902 published the very first guide to reference sources. And she had updated that in 1908 in a second edition, and then died rather suddenly in 1909. And thereafter, future editions of the Guide to Reference Sources would be published for the next 4 or 5 editions by Isidore Mudge. At the same time, she began another work of scholarship in assisting the newly minted director of libraries at Columbia, a man by the name of William Dawson, in compiling the first directory of special collections in American libraries. And she also started writing reviews for Library Journal. And it's in this association with the librarian from Columbia in writing this guide to special collections that she becomes familiar to the people at Columbia. And in 1911, is hired by Columbia, first as an assistant librarian in the serials department, and by June 15, 1911, she is appointed as the first reference librarian at Columbia, and a position that she holds for the next 30 years. This is a picture of the Butler Library Reference Room. A beautiful new library had been constructed at Columbia. It opened in 1934. It was named after the president of the university, Butler, and Butler and Mudge collaborated on a lot of projects, and in fact there's a lot of correspondence between the president and Isidore Mudge asking for answers for difficult to find questions. On the right of the screen, you can see that the very first involvement of Isidore Mudge in scholarship about reference, and that in the March 1911 edition of Library Journal, she began writing a column called Some Reference Books of 1910. And she would continue doing this for the next 20 years. And I have an affinity for Isidore Mudge because in 1986, I began doing a similar column for Library Journal, which I would continue for some 30 years until 2016. On the left, you can see another work of her scholarship, again with her close friend Minnie Sears, a George Eliot dictionary, in which she describes all the characters and scenes and novels from the writings of George Eliot. By 1941, she had amassed the largest reference collection in the world at Columbia. It boasts dictionaries in some 44 languages, general encyclopedias, 2,000 volumes of indexes, a large collection of annuals, and dozens of quotation books. And she had brought these in from other parts of the library. The indexes had been moved from periodicals, the printed catalogs and biographical dictionaries had moved from cataloging to reference. She moved all the trade and national bibliographies from the order department. One of the philosophies that she and the staff at the reference department at Columbia began teaching was that the library patrons ask serious questions only when they have reason to believe that the question will receive serious attention from the librarian. And her fame as an answer of difficult to come up with the questions began to become widespread at Columbia. This is an example of what would become the motto for the reference department at Columbia. A famous quote, God Almighty hates a quitter. She had been contacted by President Butler, who claimed to have overheard at the Republican convention of the day this expression, God Almighty hates a quitter, but he wanted to, in good fashion, verify this source. And Isidore and the reference staff began this long search in Republican newspapers and other sources of the day, trying to find who might have said this quotation. And having been at it for some time and coming up empty, she conceived of what she would later call the enemy sources approach. If you can't find what you're looking for in the favorable sources, in this case the Republican source at the time, you ought to look in the opposition sources. And in the second or third Democratic newspapers of the time, they came up with an answer to who had used this expression, God Almighty hates a quitter. Another approach that she developed and taught in some of the classes on reference at Columbia was what she would call the kaleidoscope approach. And that approach was, if one approach proves fruitless, you should abandon it entirely and try an approach from an entirely different angle. And she used this to good effect and taught the staff and a whole generation of reference librarians how to use this approach. This is, again, a famous quote of Isidore Mudge, that incessantly and doggedly verifying titles to produce the most reliable and definitive information. And I think she was concerned that you needed to dispel the false news of the day by verification, not in one source, but in several sources, and I think this became standard fare when people approached librarians at the Columbia Reference Desk.
So, how do we apply this philosophy to today's library?
Well, I thought I would use the example of our own institution here at Western Kentucky University to talk about how we've learned from the Mudge philosophy and the impact that using that philosophy has had as we've developed librarians as scholars over the last 40 years. Western Kentucky University today is a regional institution with international aspirations of about 21,000 students. It's grown from a small teachers college to a university, and then a university offering doctoral programs. It was founded in 1906 in Bowling Green, Kentucky. Until the 1960s, the faculty, including the librarians, were faculty, but without tenure, status, or title. And at that time, it was decided to create colleges, and the library became a separate college. But librarians were not sure, what did faculty status mean? Did they have titles? Did they enjoy salaries comparative to the rest of faculty? And how long should they work? Should they be on faculty contracts of 9 months? Should they work 10 months? Should they work 12 months? And by the 1970s, there's a gradual shift of librarians at Western from being merely in a service profession to increasingly being driven by scholarship. And we think that might have developed from a librarian, Evelyn Thurman, who's been honored here with a special award. Evelyn Thurman had been a librarian trained in Kentucky and Tennessee, who had spent some years as a librarian and teacher at military bases abroad in Germany and Japan and Bermuda, had traveled to 56 different countries already by the 1970s, and in the 1970s began her scholarship by her fascination with the novels of Laura Ingalls Wilder and Rebecca Caudle, and began publishing a series of books and giving lectures widely about their role in children's literature. And in 1981, the first departments at university libraries at Western were established. 3 large departments: special collections, public services, technical services, each with its separate department. At that time, in 1981, then the Department of Library Public Services decided to require as a minimum entry-level credential that you would have an accredited library degree, but also an advanced degree, either a master's or a doctorate. Along with that, librarians began receiving tenure, and their promotion pattern began mirroring that of other faculties. They also received private offices and spaces, help from student assistants, and I, as a department head for the Department of Library Public Services, began being asked to mentor new library faculty in this librarian as scholar role.
Oh, excuse me. We didn't talk about the Q tag, and that's a grant that we can get for a quick, short research run somewhere, or some other rather small, below $3,000, but some money that we need to further research, and we have to do the research within 3 months of the granting of the application. But this is also something that we can use to further our research when it takes some money to travel or get special materials that we don't have here.
And I think, Rosemary, that's been a big benefit, don't you? That
I think so too.
Yeah, we launched it, I guess, in
about 3 years, 3 years ago.
3 years ago. And to give you an example of what you can use a quick turnaround grant, and I think the libraries were provided between $6,000 and $7,000, and we have a library faculty of about 26, 27 librarians. This year, we awarded library faculty QTAG grants for a researcher working on Cynthia Mae Carver, or Cousin Emmy, who is a nationally known folk singer from Kentucky. We awarded a grant to conduct research on Kentucky librarians and World War I at the War Service Papers Archives of ALA at the University of Illinois. One librarian used it to hire staff to expand his classical music navigator, which is a website he used to promote and compare various kind of classical composers. Another used it to conduct research at the Newberry Library's extensive collection of Chicago city and phone directories for a genealogical guide to Italian Americans for a paper she's working on. Yet another used it to travel to the Computers and Libraries Conference in Washington, D.C. to do research at the Smithsonian and the Library of Congress for a project he and his wife are working on makerspaces. And finally, a special collections librarian used her QTAG grant to present a paper in London on books, publishing, and research.
So that's quite a benefit, but what else?
You know, this slide just talks about the nature of scholarship over the last 5 years. We have a new incoming dean, and just give you a sample of kinds of things that this approach has produced at Western. On the far left, you can see one of our humanities, social science and humanities librarian published in 2016 a biography of Una Merkel, the actress with sassy wit and southern charm, and which was selected by Huffington Post as one of the top 10 books on film in 2016. Our website and virtual library coordinator, Haiwang Wan, who's a native of Tianjin, China, and a prolific publisher, began translating a series of children's books, originally published and written in French, which had been translated into Chinese, and now translated them back into English. And they're being widely marketed and used in China as a way of teaching Chinese students how to speak English. Catherine Panavaria, whose office we're using today, wrote a practical guide to genealogy, and she's recently published with our head of reference here a new treatise on providing reference services, a practical guide for librarians, which has just been published last month. Our science bibliographer, who's a world-class expert on the works of Alfred Russel Wallace, published, this is one of many books he's published on Wallace called Dear Sir, 69 Years of Alfred Russel Wallace Letters. And again, Mr. Wan published the third of a series of books he's published on Tibetan folktales. So over the course of the last 5 years, faculty at WKU have published 10 books, probably 60 articles, made almost 200 presentations in 5 or 6 countries around the world. So it's been a real flourishing of librarians as scholars.
So let's take a quick moment to poll our audience. So we're curious to know, are librarians at your institution involved in scholarship? So on the screen you'll see the poll, so please submit your answer. Okay, great. Let's take a quick look at the responses. So it looks like overwhelmingly 72% say yes, librarians are involved, and about 28% are saying no. So Brian, Rosemary, is that what you expected?
Yeah.
I think that's a very good response. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So let's resume with the benefits of being a scholar librarian.
Well, a number of people have written about the benefits of librarians as scholars. One, in fact, in 2017, in an issue of Librarian's Journal, which is published in the Middle East and Saudi Arabia, Mahmoud Zakaria commented recently that one of the most important factors that may help a librarian to succeed in his or her professional life is to participate in scholarly communication and to be a librarian author or a scholar practitioner. And he adds that it's important for librarians to be involved in publishing in order to support the scholarly communication process. So there's certainly a strong belief, at least by a certain portion of the library community, that librarians should be about scholarship. Our own science reference librarian, as I mentioned, who's a world-class specialist on Alfred Russel Wallace and has been recently inducted into the Linnaean Society of London, outlined what he thought were, recently in an issue for Kentucky Libraries, what he thought were 5 reasons why we might want to have librarians as scholars. And one, so that they might become more familiar with the operational needs of their patrons in doing scholarship. 2, that by undertaking scholarship yourself through practice, you become more adept at search techniques yourself and makes you better able to assist patrons in their needs. 3, that you're likely to encounter new tools and databases that you may turn and find useful in aiding your patrons, your students, your staff, your faculty in solving their research problems. 4, that this is kind of like a value-added service that you're able to provide to your institution by extending the level of scholarship done at that institution, and that you focus additional attention both on your library and your university. And finally, that I think you'll find, and that's been our experience here, hasn't it, Rosemary? Yes. That when you're perceived as a scholar librarian, that people seem to have a higher level of confidence in you providing service for them.
Yes, I agree. I think it's been said that to help a scholar, you should be a scholar.
And that was a famous quote she's
Yes.
talking about by Constance Winchell, and she believed that, and she often remarked to her staff that, gee, it's important that you know how to do some of this research yourself. And she was decrying the elimination of the master's thesis in MLS programs of the time.
So let's get on to developing research ideas. How do you do it?
Well, you know, I got asked last year for the very first time with several of my fellow department heads to talk and mentor to new faculty about how do you get involved in this research process and where did you get your ideas. And this, so I'm a Canadian born in a small town in southern Alberta, and I was telling the group earlier this year that on my way to choir practice at the local church in Lethbridge, Alberta, I would ride the bus down some 4 blocks from the church and get off the bus, and while walking would cross 9th Street, and I would look down on 9th Street and I would see the name Coutts, which is my surname, and I would think to myself rather smugly, hey, we must be someone of some import. They've named the street after us. And I would later learn as a researcher that the street wasn't named after us. We were the progeny of a poor coal miner, but it was named for a very famous, perhaps the most famous woman in 19th century Britain, the Baroness Burdett Coutts, who became the greatest philanthropist of the 19th century. And that not only the street, but the town of Coutts and the town of Barons and Burdett, all named for this famous philanthropist who had founded the Society of Prevention of Cruelty to Children and to Animals, and built churches around the world. So a famous individual. And since that time, I've been collecting research material on the Baroness, and I acquired a number of documents. And with a colleague a number of years ago, we have begun the first steps to create a website, a research website on the Baroness Burdett Coutts.
So that's how it started. So
another, again, speaking from a personal standpoint, and I'm sure you people listening have had similar experiences. I had the occasion as a relatively young undergraduate student to do a study abroad to British Honduras, now Belize, and began a research project in those days on finding the beginning of the chiclet or chewing gum business, which Wrigley's had established in the latter part of the 19th century. And I began writing a research project on chicleros. And you can see on the left of your screen the picture of a sapodilla tree where, very much like gathering rubber, you would clamber up the tree with a machete and make diagonal cuts and collect the resin, which would be then put into molds and shipped to the Wrigley Company in Chicago. But my stays, several of which in Belize, interested me in the country, and I had the occasion to make many return visits to Belize, and determined that there was very little reference information about the country or its politicians, and took it upon myself to interview all of the prime ministers of Belize, and to write a series of sketches in the Encyclopedia of Latin American History and Culture in several editions, and have since embarked on written with a colleague, Peggy Wright, a volume on Belize and the World Bibliographical Series, and we're currently at work on a historical dictionary of Belize. Other ideas, we spend long times, don't we, Rosemary, sitting at the reference desk, especially in the summer when sometimes there's not a lot of business. And while sitting at the reference desk one afternoon, I began getting a series of questions from a fashion design class, and they were concerning the requirement that each of them had to do research on a fashion designer. And there were relatively few, in the days before the internet, relatively few reference sources on fashion designers, particularly American fashion designers, and Fairchild had published one or two. And I conceived of this idea, wouldn't it be great if we had a handy one-volume encyclopedia of fashion? And I took this idea to a midwinter convention, and in speaking in conversation with someone from Gale Press, introduced them to my idea for a new reference book on contemporary fashion. And that book would later be published, and one of my colleagues at Western would write a series of 35 or 40 sketches for the contemporary fashion encyclopedia. Another example of how these things sometimes happen by chance, while wandering through the convention floor at a Library Association convention, I stopped at the Rutledge booth and to chat with the people at Rutledge and to compliment them on their recent encyclopedia of Spanish contemporary culture. And I was standing there with a colleague, my friend Taiwan Wan, originally from China, and he mentioned had they thought of doing a book on an encyclopedia of contemporary Chinese culture. And they said they were in the beginning stages of doing that, and they invited Mr. Wan, who then would write a series of 32 articles for the Encyclopedia of Contemporary Chinese Culture. Today, people often ask, well, as we see a somewhat decline in printed reference sources and the rise of online reference sources or dual sources which function both in a print and online environment, there are, I think, tremendous opportunities out there for for librarians to be engaged in contributing to online encyclopedias, both at the state and local level and at the national level. And this is simply an example. Some 5 or 6 years ago, the people at the state library and the humanities organization in Louisiana established their very own online encyclopedia, which they called Know Louisiana. And I, among lots of other contributors, have been invited to contribute articles and copy for this new online encyclopedia. The advantage of which, as you can imagine, is that you can include sound, so it's not only can you hear Louis Armstrong or a famous jazz musician, you can see pictures of him, you can read about him, but you can hear some of his music.
Right. Yeah. So geography again has come up as a good source of research.
Yes.
So we thank you for listening, Brian. You've given us quite a lot of ideas on how to go about our research. Thank you for that, and I'm glad you're my colleague.
Well, it's always a pleasure to chat with you, Rosemary. Yeah.
And Brian and Rosemary, let's learn a little bit more about the audience with our final poll. So we're curious to know, what kind of scholarship are you expected to be involved in? Is it library science, a topic of your choice, both, or are you not involved in scholarship? All right, looks like we're still getting some answers. All right, let's take a look at the results. So we're seeing about 36% at both, and then an even split between library science and topic of choice. Rosemary, Brian, how does that look to you? Is that what you expected?
You know, I think that's pretty common. I think initially, I know Isidore Mudge believed that you shouldn't be engaged in all kinds of scholarship, that you as a librarian should contribute to enhancing librarianship as a profession. But in so doing, you should also be, don't you think, Rosemary, involved in a broader look at scholarship? And here at Western, we are not bound by writing articles only in library-related journals and magazines, but allowed to, if you're the science bibliographer and one of your passions is a famous scientist, well, we encourage you to expand on that. My colleague Rosemary is a specialist in government documents, but also wrote a book a number of years ago on the role of women in the American military, and so there's just lots of opportunities. It depends on institutions, and I think librarians need to advocate for a broader look at how librarians can be scholars.
Yeah, the liaison between the librarian and in an academic library, you liaison with the department, usually social sciences, humanities sciences, and your involvement in a field of study in each of those broader disciplines gives you a lot of street cred with the faculty when you're on the same level as they are with regard to research, or not far behind them, or have your specialty in their area. It gives you just a lot of things to talk about to you, to your faculty.
And Isidore Mudge would have said you should pursue your passion. You have to be passionate about scholarship, or you won't be a good scholar.
Yes.
Great. Well, on that note, we do have a few questions from the audience.
Yes.
So let's start with the first one. We received, Brian, most of the examples of research by librarians you're discussing are historical research, but to the extent that librarians as a group have formal research training, it's not in history, but in social science methods, studying user behavior, etc. Can you discuss how librarians without formal education in history should approach the question of whether to pursue historical research?
I think you can depends on your training. We have here at Western librarians trained in statistics and business. So we having given some examples of historical research, I think you can be doing sophisticated research in behavior, in use of materials, and in all sorts of different fields. So it doesn't have to be simply historical.
History is Brian's passion, I should say. He got his PhD in history, and history is my passion too. So that's where our heads go first. But I've also been collaborating with Catherine Penavaria of the Genealogical Book on genealogy seminars for our local public libraries, and also webinars for our state library system. And various other groups that are interested in this. So it doesn't always have to be history. It could be software. It could be anything dealing with technology. That's a fine area of research.
And for example, it can be language. It could be Chinese. One of our librarians has written 2 of the standard guides to teaching law to reference librarians. So it can be a very broad discipline approach.
Great. Okay, and moving on. What publications do you recommend submitting work to for new librarians or librarians who have not had positions where they published previously? How do you search requests for papers?
There is very broad library science literature out there, and I think the key is to develop the research ideas. People often ask, should you write, Rosemary, should you write, do the research first and then search for a publisher? I think I don't like to get too far along in the research process without having reached out to colleagues who might know of a possible outlet for that publication. My colleague here, Rosemary Meszaros, is a longtime editor at the Journal of Academic Librarianship, which is the premier outlet for academic librarianship in the country. But you can begin, can't you, Rosemary, with your state library journal?
Oh, sure.
You can expand into there are specific library journals for reference, for collection development, for our Dean of Libraries, Connie Foster here, for many, many years was the editor of Serials Librarianship, but each of the various aspects of librarianship has very specialized journals, and there are then very broad journals to publish in.
Yeah.
Plus, there are many online publications and environments which today you can publish in.
Yeah, watch out for the predators, but an established journal, library journal, I would do it this way: the cart before the horse, the chicken before the egg. First of all, get an idea of what you'd like to do. Do maybe an abstract, and then look for an outlet to publish in. Is this going to be a journal article? Is it going to be a book? Is it going to be more? Poster. There used to be a saying, the 3 Ps: poster, presentation, and publication. So you can throw that idea out at various library conferences as a presentation or a poster. And then once you're kind of solid on what you'd like to research, or you think there's enough there, then take a look at who's publishing what, whether it be a journal or whether it be a publisher itself that seem to specialize, say, in reference books or in workbooks or anything that is of your same bent. So I would put my toe in the water first before jumping in.
Yeah, if it's worth researching, it's worth getting published. That's a famous quote from one of our reference instructors.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Great. Yes, there are a couple more. Is scholarship considered only publishing? And what about librarians taking online courses?
Well, that dead silence that came up.
Well, we don't have.
Depends on where you are, I think, what your university or public library or a special library, what they consider scholarship, because it is an individual thing. Generally, the tried and true publication is surely scholarship, but I also think that teaching itself is a scholarly occupation. So, but Brian is my department head, so we have to look toward the philosophy of where you are, your institution, and how they put a premium on these different outlets.
And you don't have to be a faculty member to be a scholar. I think there's some
No.
confusion out there. You can be a school librarian, you can be a public librarian.
Sure.
I think Isidore Mudge and Melville Dewey would have agreed that any librarian can be a scholar.
Yeah.
Great. And we have one more for now. Do you think a PhD has value for a librarian, possibly a thesis in library science or something else?
I think, I know Constance Winchell would have been a believer in, and she did say that, some kind of advanced training in the research process can be beneficial, not only in your role as a librarian, but also in developing your research techniques. I have a PhD. I don't think it's absolutely necessary to be a scholar to have a PhD. I do think it's important to require some advanced training in research. Although our scholar as librarian, Mr. Hart, was entirely self-taught, so it is certainly possible to train yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do not have a PhD. I do have a master's in history and, of course, a library science degree. More like personal preference, not wanting to go through the PhD program, the rigorous program, and I didn't start librarianship until an advanced age, so I didn't want to keep going to school. I wanted to practice my profession full time, so I did not get on the PhD track. And like Brian, I don't think it's necessary to have a PhD to be a scholar.
Isidore Mudge used to say, you need to read a lot, and
yes.
A good reader leads to good writing skills. So that was what she taught.
Yeah, agree. Yeah, and beside the reading, the curiosity, I think, just plays such a great role. To want to find out answers, to want to find out questions, to keep reading, to keep discussing things with your colleagues, going to conferences, opening up to all the beautiful possibilities there are out there in the world of scholarship. That's a wonderful thing.
Right. And speaking of Isidore Mudge, we have one audience member asking if there is an Isidore Mudge fan club or any other helpful resources.
One of the enormous collection of her papers has been preserved in the archives at Columbia University. And in fact, the two pictures that we showed, I think one of them for the very first time, were recovered by the very kind folks at the Special Collections unit at the Butler Library. I know Isidore Mudge would have been proud. John Waddell, that's W-A-D-D-E-L-L, has written a dissertation, not a book, but a dissertation in 1973 called The Career of Isidore G. Mudge, a chapter in the history of reference librarianship. And one thing we learned is that, Isidore Mudge was not only passionate about librarianship, but she was passionate about raising flowers, traveling. She traveled abroad on 8 or 9 different trips. It's said that she raised so many daffodils at her farm that in the 1940s, some 40,000 daffodils were cut and sold on the streets of New York to raise money for the war effort. So she had broad interests.
Great. Well, let's give everyone a few more minutes back from the hour, but I want to thank everyone for joining. It was great to see such an engaged audience. We got a bunch of comments as well. So if you do have any further questions or comments to share with Rosemary or Brian, you can share those in the follow-up survey that we'll be sending out to you right after this webinar and in your follow-up email. So do keep that in mind. And thank you very much, Brian and Rosemary. It was a great talk.
Well, have a great afternoon, everyone.
It's our pleasure.